This is Lorraine Matthews, and today I'm sharing the story of how my stepdaughter told me I wasn't welcome in my own home, and how I made sure she never forgot the moment she lost everything she thought she was entitled to. The moment my stepdaughter looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're not welcome in this house until you change your mind," something inside me snapped. She thought she had the power. She thought her father's silence meant she'd won. But what she didn't know was that the house she tried to ban me from was already half mine. And by the time she came back, it wouldn't just be gone, it would belong to the one man she never thought she'd see standing on this porch again, her ex-husband. Let me back up and tell you how I got to that moment, sitting at my own dinner table, being told I wasn't welcome in my own home. I was 52 when I married Harold, stepping into a house that felt more like a museum than a home. Every room was frozen in time, exactly as his late wife Margaret had left it 3 years earlier. Her perfume bottles still lined the bathroom counter. Her coffee mug with the faded flowers sat untouched in the kitchen cabinet. Even her reading glasses remained on the nightstand, waiting for her to come back and finish the book she'd never complete. Harold couldn't bear to change anything, and I understood grief. I really did. But understanding something and living with it every single day are two very different things. Make yourself at home, Harold had said on our wedding night. But how do you make yourself at home in someone else's shrine? How do you hang your clothes next to dresses that still smell like another woman's perfume? How do you cook in a kitchen where every pot and pan carries memories of meals you never shared? The real problem wasn't the house, though. It was Kendra. Harold's 34-year-old daughter had her mother's sharp green eyes and her father's stubborn streak, and she used both like weapons against me from day one. In her mind, I wasn't just an intruder. I was a grave robber, stealing her mother's place before the body was even cold. "She's not my mother," I heard her whisper to Harold one evening, thinking I was upstairs. "And she never will be." Harold's response was always the same: silence. He'd clear his throat, change the subject, or just walk away. Never once did he defend me. Never once did he tell his daughter that I deserved respect as his wife. That silence spoke louder than any insult ever could. The first real battle happened during Thanksgiving preparation. I'd offer to help cook, thinking maybe we could bond over something as simple as chopping vegetables. Kendra arrived that morning with bags of groceries and a look that could freeze water. "I'll handle the cooking," she announced without even glancing at me. "Mom's recipes. The way Dad likes them." "I'd love to help," I said gently. "Maybe I could make the stuffing or—" "No, thank you." Her voice was ice. "We have traditions in this family. Traditions you wouldn't understand." Harold stood in the doorway listening to every word of this exchange. I looked at him hopefully, waiting for him to step in. Surely, he would remind his daughter that I was part of this family too. But he grabbed his coffee and disappeared into his study, leaving me standing there like a scolded child. I spent that entire Thanksgiving setting the table and staying out of the way while Kendra cooked her mother's recipes in what she clearly considered her mother's kitchen. When we finally sat down to eat, she'd placed a framed photo of Margaret at the head of the table, right where I should have been sitting as Harold's wife. I found myself squeezed into a corner spot, feeling more like an unwelcome guest than family. "Mom always said the secret to good gravy was patience," Kendra announced, stirring the gravy boat with theatrical precision. She'd stand at that stove for hours, never rushing. She understood that good things take time. The message was crystal clear. I was the rushed decision, the shortcut, the woman who didn't understand the value of patience or tradition. Harold nodded along, praising the familiar flavors and sharing memories of Thanksgivings past. I might as well have been invisible. Christmas was worse. Kendra insisted on decorating the tree exactly as her mother had done, with the same ornaments in identical positions. She hung Margaret's stocking alongside Harold's and hers, leaving no space for mine. When I quietly asked Harold about it later, he just shrugged. She's still grieving, he said. These holidays are hard for her. Give her time. But how much time? How many holidays would I spend feeling like an outsider in my own home? How many family gatherings would I endure being treated like I didn't belong? The breaking point came that first spring. I'd planted a small patch of daisies and marigolds in the front garden. Nothing fancy, just something to brighten up the entrance and make the house feel a little bit mine. For a brief moment every morning, walking up to those cheerful flowers made me smile. It felt like I'd finally added something personal to this place. I came home from grocery shopping one afternoon to find my flowers torn up by their roots, lying wilted on the driveway. The soil had been overturned and smoothed flat, as if nothing had ever been planted there. I stood holding my grocery bags, staring at the destruction, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Kendra stopped by, Harold mentioned casually when I found him reading in the living room. She said Margaret always kept that space empty because she liked the clean look. So she ripped up my flowers? Harold looked uncomfortable, not meeting my eyes. She was just trying to help maintain the property value. She knows about landscaping. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Harold's steady breathing, and something crystallized in my mind. This would never end. Kendra would never accept me, and Harold would never stand up to her. I could plant 1,000 gardens, and she would destroy them all. I could try for 1,000 years to earn my place in this family, and I would always be the outsider looking in. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I still believed time and persistence might eventually win them over. So I kept trying. I started handling the household bills because Harold seemed overwhelmed by paperwork after Margaret's death. He'd always relied on his wife to manage finances, and after she passed, bills just piled up on his desk until late notices started arriving. "You're good with numbers," he said, handing me a stack of statements with obvious relief. Margaret always handled this stuff. I never had the head for it. I took over gladly. I balanced the checkbook, paid the mortgage, handled insurance paperwork. Harold signed whatever I put in front of him without reading it. He trusted me completely with money, even if he couldn't trust me enough to defend me to his daughter. Gradually, more financial responsibilities fell to me. When we needed to refinance the mortgage, I handled the paperwork. When property taxes came due, I wrote the checks. When insurance needed updating, I made the calls. Harold was happy to let me deal with everything, and I found it oddly comforting to have control over something in this house, even if it was just the bills. After we'd been married 2 years, Harold decided to add my name to the deed. "You're my wife," he said simply. "This is your home too." It was one of the few times he'd ever acknowledged my place in his life so directly. We went to the lawyer together and signed all the paperwork as tenants in common. Legally, I owned 50% of this house and could sell my share independently if I chose to. Kendra was furious about this development. "You're giving away Mom's house," she accused Harold during one of their private conversations that I pretended not to overhear. "That woman is going to sell it the minute you die and keep all the money for herself." "Don't be ridiculous," Harold replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's not like that." The seed had been planted, though. I could see doubt growing in Harold's eyes over the following weeks. He started asking questions about the bills I was paying, wanting to see statements and receipts. He'd never shown interest in finances before, but suddenly he was suspicious of every expense. It hurt to realize his daughter's poison was working its way into his mind. The house had become a battlefield, and I was losing the war. Kendra visited almost daily, always finding new ways to remind me I didn't belong. She'd rearrange furniture back to how her mother had it. She'd replace towels I'd bought with her mother's old ones. She'd cook Harold his favorite meals and make pointed comments about Margaret's superior versions. "Mom's meatloaf was legendary," she'd say, watching Harold take a bite of mine. "Remember how she'd spend all afternoon in the kitchen, making sure everything was perfect?" She never took shortcuts. The implication was always there. I was the shortcut, the cheap substitute, the woman who could never measure up to the Saint Margaret had become in death. I started avoiding family dinners. I started spending more time away from the house. I started wondering why I'd ever thought this marriage could work. Harold was a good man, but he was weak, and his weakness was destroying any chance we had at happiness. That's when I first started thinking about selling the house. It wasn't malicious at first, just practical. The place was too big for two people, especially two people growing further apart every day. It was expensive to maintain, with its old heating system and constant repairs. And it was full of ghosts, not just Margaret's memory, but the ghosts of all my dreams about making it feel like home. I mentioned it casually to Harold one evening while we watched television. "Have you ever thought about downsizing?" I asked. "This place is awfully big for just the two of us." He looked at me like I'd suggested burning down the neighborhood. "This is Kendra's childhood home," he said firmly. "She grew up here. All her memories of her mother are tied to this place." "But Kendra doesn't live here anymore," I pointed out gently. "She has her own apartment across town. That doesn't matter. This house belongs to her as much as it belongs to me. More, maybe. She was born here." And there it was, the truth he'd never spoken aloud. This wasn't my house, and never would be. This was Kendra's house, held in trust by her father until she was ready to claim it. I was just the temporary caretaker, the woman warming the bed until Harold died and left everything to his precious daughter. I started doing research anyway, not because I was planning anything specific, but because I needed to know what options existed. I looked up comparable houses in the neighborhood, studied recent sales prices, and called a few realtors for informal estimates. The house was worth more than I'd expected, almost double what Harold had paid 20 years earlier. One realtor, a friendly woman named Susan, was particularly helpful. She'd grown up in the area and knew most properties' histories. When I described our house, she got excited. "Oh, I know that house. Beautiful colonial with a wraparound porch? I actually have a cash buyer who's been asking about that exact property for months. He's pre-approved and ready to move immediately if it ever comes on the market." I wasn't ready to sell, but knowing I could was oddly comforting. For the first time since moving into that house, I felt like I had power, some control over my destiny. I might be trapped in an impossible situation with Harold and Kendra, but I wasn't truly trapped. I had options. The months crawled by and nothing improved. If anything, Kendra's behavior got worse. She started dropping by unannounced, using her key to let herself in whenever she felt like it. She'd go through the mail, commenting on expenses and questioning purchases. She'd rearrange furniture while I was out, always putting things back exactly as her mother had arranged them. "I'm just trying to maintain the house's character," she'd say when I protested. Mom had such good taste. She knew how to make this place feel like a home. The implication was always the same. I didn't know how to make it feel like home because it wasn't truly mine and never would be. Harold's health started declining during our 3rd year of marriage. Nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of age and stress. His blood pressure climbed. His back ached constantly. He seemed tired all the time. His doctor recommended reducing stress and taking things easier. But living with constant tension between his wife and daughter was anything but easy. I suggested couples counseling. Harold refused. "We don't need strangers telling us how to live our lives," he said. I suggested maybe Kendra should respect some boundaries. That was met with stony silence. I even suggested a vacation, just the two of us, to reconnect and remember why we'd fallen in love. But Harold wouldn't leave town while Kendra was going through her divorce. Yes, Kendra was getting divorced. Her marriage to David had been crumbling for years, though she'd never mentioned problems to Harold. David was a decent man, quiet, hardworking, devoted to their two young children. But according to Kendra, he was boring and unambitious. He worked as an accountant and was perfectly happy with their middle-class life. Kendra wanted more. She wanted excitement, passion, a husband who earned more money, and took her to fancier restaurants. So she had an affair with her boss at the marketing firm where she worked. It went on for months before David found out. When he did, their marriage exploded spectacularly. David filed for divorce immediately, seeking custody of the children and fair division of assets. Kendra moved back into her old bedroom at Harold's house, my house, while she fought the divorce proceedings. Suddenly, I was sharing my home with the woman who hated me most in the world, and she was there every single day, poisoning the atmosphere with her anger and resentment. She blamed David for being inflexible. She blamed the legal system for being unfair. She blamed everyone except herself for the mess she'd created. David's being vindictive, she complained to Harold during one of their nightly conversations. He's trying to take the children away from me just to hurt me. He's claiming I'm an unfit mother because of one little mistake. One little mistake. That's how she characterized months of adultery and the destruction of her family. Harold was completely supportive throughout the divorce proceedings. He paid for her lawyer. He insisted she move back home rent-free, despite my quiet protests. When I suggested maybe she could contribute something toward household expenses, or at least help with chores, Harold got defensive. She's been through enough, he'd say. The last thing she needs is her family nickeling and diming her when she's starting over. So I watched the children whenever Kendra needed him to, even though the custody arrangement was strict and David had the most of the time anyway. I listened to her complaints about David for hours every evening, never once suggesting that maybe she bore some responsibility. I watched this unfold with growing amazement and disgust. Here was a woman who had cheated on her loyal husband, broken up her family, and abandoned her children's stability for an affair with her boss. Yet Harold treated her like the victim. He offered unlimited sympathy and support while never acknowledging the pain she had caused. Meanwhile, I, the woman who had never cheated, never lied, never betrayed anyone, was treated like an outsider in my own home. I was the one who didn't belong, who couldn't be trusted, who didn't understand family loyalty. The divorce dragged on for 8 months. 8 months of Kendra living in our house, using our kitchen, monopolizing Harold's time and attention. 8 months of listening to her complaints about David while she simultaneously tried to make my life miserable in every small way possible. She'd use all the hot water before I could shower. She'd eat food I'd bought without asking. She'd leave her dishes in the sink for me to clean. She'd smoke on the back porch, knowing I hated the smell, and leave butts scattered for me to pick up. But the worst part was watching Harold enable all this behavior. When I complained about Kendra's inconsideration, he told me to be patient because she was going through a difficult time. When I pointed out she was treating me badly, he said I was oversensitive. When I asked how long she planned to stay, he said she could stay as long as she needed. It became clear that Kendra could do no wrong in her father's eyes, while I could do nothing right. I was the problem. I was the source of tension. I was the one who needed to adjust, compromise, understand. During this time, I stayed in touch with Susan the realtor. Not because I was actively planning to sell, but because our conversations gave me hope that escape was possible if things became unbearable. Susan mentioned more than once that she had a client who'd been asking specifically about our neighborhood for months. He's recently divorced, she explained. Looking for a fresh start somewhere his children can visit comfortably. He's very motivated and has excellent financing lined up. I was curious about this mysterious buyer, but Susan maintained professional discretion about his identity. All I knew was that he was serious, qualified, and ready to move quickly if the right property became available. The final breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. We were sitting around the dinner table, Harold, Kendra, and me, eating the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon cooking. Harold was praising the meal, and for a moment I felt hopeful. Maybe we could have a pleasant family dinner for once. But then Harold started talking about his retirement plans and how he was looking forward to spending more time at home. "This house has so many memories," he said warmly. "Margaret and I were so happy here. Kendra grew up here. Someday, when I'm gone, it'll be Kendra's house, and maybe her children will grow up here too." He said it so casually, like he was discussing the weather. But his words hit me like a physical blow. He had just announced, in front of both of us, that this house would never truly be mine. That all my efforts to make it feel like home were pointless because it was always intended for Kendra. I set down my fork and looked at Harold carefully. "What about downsizing?" I asked quietly. "We talked about that before. This house is really too big for just the two of us." Harold shook his head dismissively. "I'm not interested in selling. This house has too much history, too much meaning. It wouldn't be right to let strangers live here." I wasn't ready to give up. "Maybe we could find something smaller nearby," I suggested. "Something that could be truly ours together. A place where we could make new memories instead of living surrounded by old ones." That's when Kendra spoke up. She'd been quiet through most of the meal, but now she leaned forward across the table, her green eyes blazing with cold fury. "You're not welcome in this house until you change your mind about selling it," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "This was my mother's house. It's my father's house. And someday it will be my house. You have no right to even suggest getting rid of it." The words hung in the air like a slap. I felt my face burning with shame and anger, but I looked to Harold for support. Surely he would remind his daughter that I was his wife and deserved respect. Surely he would defend my right to have opinions about our shared home. But Harold just sat there. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at me. He just continued eating his pot roast as if nothing had happened, as if his daughter hadn't just told his wife she wasn't welcome in her own home. In that moment of silence, something inside me snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a rubber band pulled too tight, like a wire twisted past its breaking point. Harold had made his choice, and it wasn't me. He would always choose Kendra over me. He would always prioritize her feelings over mine. He would always see me as the outsider who had somehow imposed herself on his real family. But what Kendra didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had choices too. And I was about to make the biggest one of my life. I finished my dinner in silence, cleared the table, and went to bed early. Harold never followed me upstairs to ask if I was okay. He never apologized for his daughter's behavior. He never even acknowledged that anything wrong had happened. I lay awake most of that night, not thinking or planning or scheming, just feeling the rage course through me like electricity. By morning, that rage had crystallized into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous: determination. The next morning, while Harold was at work and Kendra was at her lawyer's office, I called Susan. "I'm ready to sell," I told her simply. "Oh, wonderful," Susan said. "I actually have that client I mentioned who's been asking about your exact property for months. Would you like me to set up a showing?" Something in her voice made me curious. "Who is it?" I asked. There was a slight pause. "David Morrison. He used to live over on Elm Street, but his ex-wife got that house in the divorce. He's been looking for something in the same school district so he can have his children for extended visits." David Morrison, Kendra's ex-husband. The man she'd cheated on and abandoned. The man she'd painted as vindictive and unreasonable. The man Harold had never bothered to get to know because he was too busy supporting his daughter's version of events. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of poetic justice. "Tell me more about this Mr. Morrison," I said. Susan filled me in on the details. David had been awarded custody of the children 3 days a week, and every other weekend. He'd received a modest settlement from the divorce, but had lost the house because Kendra had claimed it as her childhood home, and Harold had supported her claim with a financial guarantee. David was starting over at 41 with limited assets, but a steady job and excellent credit. "He's a nice man," Susan said. "Very devoted to his children. He's been looking for a house for months, but everything decent in this school district is out of his price range." When I mentioned your property might be coming on the market, his eyes lit up. Of course they did. This was where he'd lived with Kendra before she destroyed their marriage. This was the neighborhood where his children had friends and familiarity. This was the place he'd probably driven past countless times, remembering happier days before his world fell apart. "Set up the showing," I said. "But don't mention to anyone else that we're considering selling. I want to keep this completely quiet." Susan understood discretion, and she arranged for David to view the house the following Saturday while Harold was at his weekly golf game and Kendra was with her children. I wanted to meet this man who had been married to Harold's daughter, this man whose life had been turned upside down by the same selfish behavior I witnessed every day. David Morrison was nothing like I'd expected. Based on Kendra's descriptions, I'd imagined a bitter, angry man seeking revenge against his ex-wife. Instead, I found a quiet, thoughtful person who spoke softly and moved carefully through the house, clearly fighting strong emotions. "I'm sorry," he said when Susan introduced us. "This must be awkward, given that you're Kendra's stepmother. I hope there are no hard feelings about my interest in the house." "No hard feelings at all," I assured him. "I'm more interested in finding the right buyer than worrying about family politics." David toured the house with obvious appreciation. He admired the hardwood floors Harold had refinished 20 years earlier. He praised the kitchen updates I'd made the previous spring. He stood for a long time in the backyard, looking at the swing set that was still there from when Kendra's children visited. "My kids would love that swing set," he said quietly. "They miss having a yard to play in." Over the course of the showing, David shared his story with more honesty than I'd expected. He'd loved Kendra deeply and had been blindsided by her affair. He tried to save their marriage, even suggesting counseling and a fresh start, but she'd already made up her mind to leave. "I'll be honest," he said, his voice growing quieter. "Part of me wants this house because it would give my kids stability. They could walk to the same school, keep their friends, have consistency." He paused, looking almost embarrassed. "But if I'm being completely honest, part of me also wants Kendra to drive by someday and realize she lost more than she ever gained. Maybe that makes me petty, but I'm tired of being the only one who has to be noble about everything." "She painted me as controlling and unsupportive," David said sadly. "She told the judge I was trying to limit her career opportunities and keep her trapped in a boring suburban life. But the truth is, I just wanted our family to stay together. I thought we were happy." The irony was heartbreaking. Here is a man who had genuinely loved Kendra and wanted to build a life with her, and she had thrown it all away for an affair that had burned out within months of the divorce being finalized. Her boss had never left his own wife, and Kendra had ended up alone, bitter, and financially struggling. But David wasn't bitter. He was hurt, certainly, but he spoke about Kendra with sadness rather than anger. He was more concerned about the impact of the divorce on their children than about getting revenge on his ex-wife. "I just want to give my kids stability," he explained. "They've been through enough upheaval. If I could buy a house in this neighborhood, they could stay in the same schools, keep the same friends. It would make the whole custody arrangement easier for everyone." That's when I knew David Morrison was exactly the right buyer for this house. Not just because he could afford it or because the sale would accomplish my goals, but because he deserved it. He deserved a fresh start. He deserved a home where he could build new memories with his children. He deserved to turn his pain into something positive. And Kendra deserved to see the man she'd betrayed and abandoned standing on the porch of the house she'd tried to claim as her birthright. We talked numbers, and David's offer was fair. Not the highest I might get on the open market, but reasonable and backed by solid financing. More importantly, he could close quickly. Cash from his divorce settlement plus a small mortgage would make the transaction simple and fast. I'll need to discuss this with my husband, I told David and Susan. But I'm very interested in moving forward. After they left, I sat in the quiet house thinking about what I was planning to do. Harold would be devastated. He'd never agree to sell the house, especially not to Kendra's ex-husband. He'd see it as a betrayal of everything he held dear. But Harold had betrayed me first. He betrayed our marriage every time he chose his daughter over his wife. He'd betrayed my trust every time he allowed Kendra to disrespect me in our shared home. He betrayed my dreams of building a life together every time he made it clear that I was temporary while Kendra was permanent. I pulled out the deed and studied it carefully. Joint ownership meant I had the legal right to sell my half of the property. With Harold's signature, we could sell the whole house quickly and easily. Without his cooperation, I could force a partition sale through the courts, though that would be messy and take months. But there was another way, a simpler way. Harold trusted me with all financial decisions. He signed whatever paperwork I put in front of him without reading it carefully. In 3 years of marriage, he'd never questioned a single document I'd asked him to sign. He trusted me completely with money matters, even if he couldn't trust me enough to defend me to his daughter. That trust would be his downfall. Over the next few weeks, I prepared carefully. I gathered all necessary paperwork for a house sale, deed, property surveys, tax records, mortgage information. I reviewed our joint finances and calculated exactly how much money we'd net from the sale after paying off the remaining mortgage and covering closing costs. It was substantial, more than enough to buy a smaller place outright and have money left over. I also found an apartment, a small but comfortable place across town, close to shopping and public transportation. Month-to-month lease, no long-term commitment. Just in case things went badly with Harold, and I needed somewhere to go quickly. The hardest part was keeping everything secret from both Harold and Kendra. I had to schedule calls with Susan when they weren't around. I had to review documents when Harold was at work or playing golf. I had to hide my excitement and nervousness behind a mask of normalcy. But I'd been hiding my true feelings for 3 years already. I'd become an expert at pretending everything was fine when my world was falling apart. Adding a few more secrets to the pile wasn't difficult. The paperwork was ready by the end of March. David's financing was approved. The closing was scheduled for the first week of April. All I needed was Harold's signature on the sales contract, and everything would be set in motion. I chose my moment carefully. It was a Thursday evening, and Harold was relaxed after a good day on the golf course with his friends. He'd had a couple of beers with dinner and was in an unusually good mood. Kendra was out with friends, so we had the house to ourselves. "I need you to sign some papers," I said casually, bringing him a small stack of documents along with his evening coffee. Some routine financial stuff and a limited power of attorney form, so I can handle more of the banking when you're playing golf. Harold barely glanced at the papers before reaching for his pen. This was our normal routine. I handled the paperwork, he provided the signature, no questions asked. The power of attorney document was real and necessary, a simple form for household and financial matters that Susan had helped me get notarized earlier. Harold never questioned it, since I'd been handling all our banking for years anyway. But tonight, something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the thickness of the stack. Maybe it was something in my voice. Maybe he was finally starting to pay attention to financial details he'd ignored for so long. "What exactly am I signing?" he asked, actually looking at the first page. My heart started racing, but I kept my voice calm and bored. "Property tax appeal," I said, pointing to the document on top. "The county assessed us higher than comparable properties in the neighborhood. This should get us a reduction." That part was true. I had prepared a property tax appeal, and it was sitting on top of the stack. Harold read through it quickly and signed without concern. Underneath were two more routine documents, an insurance policy update and a mortgage payment change form. Both legitimate, both requiring his signature, both perfectly normal. He signed those as well, barely reading them. Then he reached the sales contract. I held my breath as he glanced at the first page. The document was written in typical legal language, dense and formal. At a quick glance, it could have been anything: another insurance form, a mortgage refinancing, property tax documentation. "This one's pretty long," Harold commented, flipping through the pages. "It's a rider to our homeowner's insurance," I said smoothly. "They're requiring more detailed coverage documentation because of recent storm damage in the neighborhood. It's mostly boilerplate legal language." Harold nodded and signed on every line I'd marked with small yellow sticky notes. He trusted me completely. Even when his instincts told him to read more carefully, his trust in my honesty won out. Within 5 minutes, I had every signature I needed, including the power of attorney that would allow me to act on both our behalf in financial matters. Harold had no idea he'd just given me the legal authority to sell our house. The closing wasn't just scheduled for the following Friday. With David's cash offer and pre-approval and my new legal authority, it was practically guaranteed. Harold finished signing and pushed the papers back to me. "Anything else?" he asked, settling back with his coffee. "Nothing else," I said, gathering up the documents. "I'll get these filed tomorrow." But instead of filing them, I drove them directly to Susan's office. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the sales contract was officially submitted and the closing process was underway. There was no turning back now. I spent the following week in controlled panic. Every time Harold looked at me, I wondered if he somehow knew what I'd done. Every time the phone rang, I worried it might be someone calling about the sale. Every time Kendra visited, I expected her to announce she'd heard rumors about the house being sold. But nothing happened. Harold went about his normal routine: golf, television, occasional dinners out. Kendra continued her daily complaints about the divorce, her ex-husband, and the unfairness of her situation. Neither of them suspected their world was about to change forever. The closing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. That morning, I packed 2 suitcases with my most important belongings and put them in my car trunk. Not because I was planning to leave immediately, but because I wanted to be prepared for any possibility. If Harold reacted badly, if Kendra became violent or threatening, I wanted the option to walk away cleanly. I also prepared a letter for Harold. Not an apology, because I wasn't sorry. Not an explanation, because he should have understood years ago why our marriage wasn't working. Just a simple statement of facts: what I'd done, why I'd done it, and where he could find me if he wanted to talk. The closing went smoothly. David arrived at the lawyer's office with his certified check and a smile that lit up his whole face. He was finally getting his fresh start, his chance to build a stable home for his children. Susan handled all details with professional efficiency. Within 2 hours, the house legally belonged to David Morrison. I drove home slowly, knowing this would be the last time I made this familiar journey. I'd lived in that house for 3 years, but it had never felt like home. Now it belonged to someone who would actually appreciate it, someone who would fill it with love instead of resentment. Harold's car was in the driveway when I arrived, along with Kendra's. They were both inside, probably in the kitchen, having their usual afternoon conversation about her ongoing troubles. I could hear their voices through the window as I sat in my car for a moment, gathering courage for what came next. I walked into the house to find them exactly where I'd expected, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and Harold's afternoon snack. They looked up when I entered, and Harold smiled. "How was your day?" he asked, just like he had hundreds of times before. "Interesting," I replied, sitting down across from them. "I have some news to share." Something in my tone must have alerted them that this wasn't going to be normal conversation. Harold set down his coffee cup, and Kendra's eyes narrowed suspiciously. I sold the house, I said simply. The closing was this afternoon. The new owner takes possession tomorrow morning. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Harold stared at me without comprehension, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Kendra's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then pure rage. What are you talking about? Harold asked finally. You can't sell the house. We never agreed to sell the house. I pulled out a copy of the sales contract and placed it on the table in front of him. You signed the papers last Thursday, I said calmly. Right here at this table. Every signature line that was required. Harold grabbed the contract with shaking hands and began reading frantically. I watched his face change as reality sank in. His name was there, in his own handwriting, on every signature line. The date was clear. The terms were explicit. The sale was completely legal and binding. You tricked me, he whispered, his voice hollow with shock. You told me these were insurance papers. I told you what you wanted to hear, I corrected. Just like you've been telling me what you thought I wanted to hear for 3 years. The difference is, my lies actually accomplished something. Kendra snatched the contract from her father's hands and scanned it quickly. When she reached the buyer's name, her face went white. David Morrison, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. You sold our house to David? To my ex-husband. I sold my house to the highest bidder, I said calmly. The fact that he happens to be your ex-husband is just a happy coincidence. Kendra exploded. She jumped up from the table so fast her chair fell over, and for a moment I thought she might actually attack me physically. Her face was red with rage, and her hands were clenched into fists. You vindictive witch, she screamed. How could you do this? This was my mother's house. My childhood home. You had no right. I had every right, I replied, keeping my voice level. My name is on the deed. I own 50% of this property. I can sell my share whenever I choose. But you sold the whole house, Harold said, finally finding his voice. You can't sell my half without my permission. I turned to look at him with something approaching pity. Harold, you signed a sales contract for the entire property. You gave me permission when you put your signature on those papers. The fact that you didn't bother to read what you were signing doesn't make the contract invalid. Harold stared at the papers in disbelief, flipping through page after page of legal language he'd signed without reading. But I trusted you, he said plaintively. I trusted you with everything. Yes, you did. I agreed. You trusted me with the bills, the finances, all the paperwork you didn't want to deal with. But you never trusted me enough to defend me to your daughter. You never trusted me enough to make me feel welcome in our home. You never trusted me enough to build a real marriage with me. That's not true, Harold protested weakly. I love you. I married you. You married me because you were lonely, I said. And you kept me around because I was useful. I paid the bills, cooked your meals, and never complained when your daughter treated me like garbage. But love? Real love requires respect, Harold. It requires partnership. It requires choosing your spouse over everyone else, at least sometimes. Kendra was pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal, muttering curses under her breath. Suddenly, she whirled around to face me. When, she demanded. When does he take possession?
Tomorrow morning, I said.
The MOV. You'll need to have your things out by then. My things? Kendra shrieked. This is my house. I live here. Not anymore, I said simply. David Morrison owns this house now. Whether he lets you stay is between you and him. The look of horror on Kendra's face was almost worth the 3 years of misery she'd put me through. She was finally experiencing what I'd felt every day, the realization that you don't belong somewhere you thought was home. Harold was still staring at the contract, shaking his head in disbelief. There has to be something we can do, he said desperately. We can get a lawyer. We can claim fraud or coercion or something. You can try, I said. But you sign that power of attorney voluntarily, giving me full legal authority to handle our property matters. The buyer is completely legitimate. He's paying cash, above market value, and the transaction is already closed. Any legal challenge would cost thousands of dollars in attorney fees for a case you probably can't win. The reality was sinking in for both of them. Harold looked like a man who'd been hit by a truck. Kendra looked like she was planning my murder. Where are we supposed to go? Harold asked quietly. For the first time since I'd started this conversation, I felt a flicker of sympathy for my husband. He wasn't a bad man, just a weak one. His greatest sin was his inability to stand up to his daughter, and now he was paying the price for that weakness. I've put a deposit down on an apartment across town, I said gently. It's small but comfortable. There's room for both of us, if you want to try working on our marriage without Kendra's interference. Harold looked at his daughter, who was glaring at both of us with pure hatred, and then back at me. What about Kendra? He asked. What about her? I replied. She's a grown woman with her own life. Her divorce is final, her custody arrangement is settled, and she has a job. It's time for her to find her own place to live instead of hiding in her childhood bedroom. I won't leave, Kendra declared. This is my house. I don't care what papers you tricked my father into signing. I was born here, and I'm not going anywhere. That's your choice, I said calmly. But David Morrison is the legal owner now, and he can have you arrested for trespassing if you refuse to leave. Is that really the example you want to set for your children? Kendra's face crumpled at the mention of her children. She'd been so focused on her own anger and sense of entitlement that she'd forgotten about the bigger picture. Her kids would hear about this. They'd know that their mother was thrown out of their grandfather's house because their father bought it. The humiliation would be complete and public. You planned this, she accused, her voice full of venom. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? This whole thing is revenge, because I never accepted you. You're absolutely right, I admitted without shame. I did plan this, but not for months, for years. Every time you disrespected me in my own home, I thought about this moment. Every time your father chose your feelings over mine, I planned for this day. Every time you made it clear that I would never truly belong here, I prepared for my exit. Harold was looking at me like he'd never seen me before. I don't understand, he said plaintively. If you were so unhappy, why didn't you just leave? Why did you have to destroy everything? Because leaving would have meant giving up everything I'd invested in this marriage, I explained. My time, my money, my effort, my dignity. I've spent 3 years trying to build a life with you, Harold. I've paid bills, maintained this house, and put up with treatment that no wife should have to endure. I wasn't going to walk away empty-handed so that you and Kendra could pretend I never existed. But the money, Harold said desperately. What about our money? The proceeds from the sale? I reached into my purse and pulled out a cashier's check, placing it on the table next to the contract. You're half of the proceeds, I said. Minus the mortgage payoff, closing costs, and realtor fees. It's all perfectly legal and fair. Harold picked up the check with trembling hands. It was a substantial amount, enough to live on comfortably for several years if he was careful. But it wasn't enough to buy another house in this neighborhood, and it wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. This is it, he asked. This is what 30 years of my life in this house is worth. This is what your half is worth, I corrected. My half is worth the same amount. The difference is, I'm using my money to start over. You can do whatever you want with yours. Kendra grabbed the check from her father and stared at the numbers. We could fight this, she said desperately, her voice rising. We could claim elder abuse or financial exploitation. Dad's not thinking clearly. He would never have signed these papers if he understood what they meant. Her voice was getting louder, more frantic. I'll call the police right now. This has to be illegal somehow. You can't just steal someone's house. I'll have you arrested for fraud. Go ahead, I said calmly. But while you're fighting in court, David Morrison will be living in this house with his children. I'll sue you personally, Kendra shouted, standing up again and pointing at me with shaking fingers. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you are. I'll tell the whole neighborhood, all Dad's friends, everyone at his golf club. They'll know you're nothing but a gold-digging manipulator who tricked a grieving widower. She was pacing now, her voice getting shriller. And David, that pathetic loser, thinks he can just waltz back into my life and take everything? I'll make his life hell. I'll tell the school board he's unstable. I'll tell his boss he's vindictive. I'll make sure he never gets a moment's peace in this house. Kendra. Harold's voice cut through her tirade, quiet but firm. Stop. She whirled around to stare at her father, shocked by the authority in his voice. What did you say? I said stop, Harold repeated, standing up slowly. Just stop. This is enough. For the first time in years, he was telling his daughter no. The fight went out of Kendra suddenly, and she collapsed back into her chair. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked truly defeated. All her arrogance, all her sense of entitlement, all her certainty that she could control everyone around her, it was gone. Why David? She asked quietly. Of all the people you could have sold to, why him? I considered lying or giving her some noble explanation about David deserving a fresh start. But I'd spent too many years hiding my true feelings. It was time for complete honesty. Because I knew it would hurt you the most, I said simply. You destroyed that man's life because you wanted something more exciting than the love and stability he offered. You took his children, his home, and his dignity. Now he gets to start over in the house where you grew up, with enough space for his kids to visit and play in the same backyard where you once played. Kendra's eyes filled with tears. He'll poison my children against me, she whispered. They'll come here for visits, and he'll tell them how their mother ruined everything. David's not that kind of man, I said. He's not vindictive like you are. He'll probably be gracious and kind, which will make your betrayal of him even more obvious by comparison. Harold was still holding the check, staring at it like it might change into something else if he looked long enough. What happens now? He asked. Now you decide what kind of man you want to be, I said. You can come with me to the apartment and try to build a real marriage based on mutual respect. Or you can choose your daughter over your wife one more time and figure out your own living arrangements. Don't make me choose, Harold pleaded. Can't we all just work this out? Maybe David would be willing to sell the house back to us. I almost laughed at his naivety. Harold, David doesn't need to sell anything to anyone. He owns this house free and clear now. Why would he give up his fresh start so that the woman who cheated on him can move back into her childhood bedroom? The truth was finally sinking in for both of them. This wasn't a temporary setback they could overcome with the right strategy. This wasn't a misunderstanding they could clear up with better communication. This was permanent, final, irreversible. I stood up from the table and picked up the contract and the check. I'll be at the Hampton Inn tonight, I said. Room 237. If you want to try working on our marriage, Harold, you're welcome to join me. We can go to the apartment together tomorrow and start over. And if I don't, he asked quietly, then I'll move into the apartment alone, and you can figure out your own life, I said. But either way, I'm done living in a house where I'm not wanted, and I'm done being married to a man who won't defend me. I walked to the door, then turned back for one final look at them. Harold looked broken and confused, like a man who'd woken up in someone else's life. Kendra looked devastated but still angry, like a child whose favorite toy had been taken away as punishment. For what it's worth, I said to Harold, I really did love you once. I thought we could build something good together. But love isn't enough when only one person is willing to fight for the relationship. Harold opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he'd try to do better? It was too late for apologies and promises. The time for fighting for our marriage had been 3 years ago, when I first started feeling like a stranger in my own home. I left them sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the wreckage of their comfortable assumptions about how life would unfold. Harold would have to decide whether his loyalty to his daughter was worth more than his marriage to me. Kendra would have to decide whether her pride was worth more than her relationship with her father. But those decisions were no longer my problem. I'd made my choice, and I was finally free. I drove to the hotel slowly, taking a long route through the town where I'd spent 3 unsuccessful years trying to build a home. It was a pretty place, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained houses. In another life, under different circumstances, I might have been happy here. But happiness isn't just about location. It's about the people you share your life with, and whether those people value you enough to make space for your dreams and feelings. I'd spent too long trying to squeeze myself into a space that was never intended for me, trying to win love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their respect. At the hotel, I called Susan to confirm that everything had gone smoothly with a title transfer. David Morrison was officially the new owner of the house, and there were no legal complications or last-minute problems. "How did your husband take the news?" Susan asked carefully. "About as well as expected," I said. "He's shocked, but he'll survive. People are more resilient than they think." That night I sat in my hotel room, eating takeout Chinese food and watching the evening news, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, worrying about Kendra's next attack or Harold's next failure to defend me. For 3 days, my phone stayed silent. I wondered if Harold had made his choice by default, staying with the daughter who had always come first. Part of me wasn't even surprised. On the fourth day, my phone finally rang. It was Harold, and he sounded exhausted. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly.
"We can talk," I said.
"But I won't change my mind about the house. It's done."
"I know," he said.
There was a long pause. "I've been staying with Kendra. I thought maybe if I chose her, we could figure something out together. Maybe get lawyers involved, try to reverse the sale somehow." I waited, not making it easier for him. "But she doesn't want my help," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "She wants my money. She keeps asking when I'm going to get a lawyer, when I'm going to sue you, when I'm going to fix this mess I created. But when I told her I was scared and confused and didn't know what to do, she got angry at me. Said I was weak for letting you manipulate me. Said if I was stupid enough to sign papers without reading them, I deserved what I got." Another pause. "Last night, she told me I wasn't welcome at her place anymore unless I was there to discuss legal action. She said having a pathetic father was embarrassing, and she didn't want her friends to see me moping around." I felt a flicker of sympathy for him, despite everything. "I realized something sitting in that parking lot," Harold said. "I spent 3 years trying to keep everyone happy, and I ended up making everyone miserable.
Especially you.
Especially me. Kendra doesn't love me. She loves what I can do for her. And when I couldn't do anything anymore, she threw me away too." Harold. "No, let me finish," he said. "I never understood how badly Kendra was treating you because I was so afraid of conflict that I convinced myself it wasn't that serious. But you were right about everything. About her, about me, about what our marriage needed to survive. If you'll have me, I want to try to be the husband I should have been from the beginning." I thought about it for a long moment. Harold wasn't a bad man, and I had loved him once. Maybe with Kendra out of the picture, we could build something real together. Maybe the shock of losing the house would finally wake him up to what he'd been risking all along. "One chance," I said finally. But things have to be different this time. No more choosing Kendra over me. No more letting her disrespect me. No more pretending that keeping the peace is more important than protecting our marriage. I understand, Harold said. I'll be at the hotel in 20 minutes. He was actually there in 15, carrying a suitcase and wearing the expression of a man who'd finally realized what he'd almost lost. We talked until nearly dawn, and for the first time in our marriage, Harold really listened to what I was saying. He apologized for his weakness, for his failure to protect me, for the years of making me feel like an outsider in what should have been our shared home. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a start. The next morning, we drove to the old house to collect our remaining belongings. It was barely 8 a.m., but David Morrison was already there with a moving truck, directing movers who were bringing in furniture and boxes. He was polite but distant when I introduced Harold, clearly unsure how to handle the awkward situation. Kendra was there too, loading boxes into her car with sharp, angry movements. She'd clearly spent the night packing, and she looked exhausted and defeated. When she saw Harold and me together, her face hardened. "So you chose her," she said to her father, not bothering with any greeting. "I chose my wife," Harold said quietly, "the way I should have done from the beginning." "After everything I've been through," Kendra said bitterly. "After all the support you gave me during the divorce, you're going to abandon me now?" "I'm not abandoning you," Harold said. "I'm just finally putting my marriage first, the way I should have done years ago." Kendra looked like she wanted to argue further, but one of David's children came running into the yard at that moment, a little boy about 6 years old with his father's quiet eyes and a huge smile. He headed straight for the swing set, and his laughter filled the air as he began to pump his legs and soar higher and higher. The sound seemed to deflate Kendra completely. This was one of David's children from his new relationship, innocent of all the adult drama that had brought him to this house. The little boy's presence was a reminder of how much Kendra had lost through her own choices, and how much David had gained by moving forward instead of looking back. We finished loading our belongings in silence, with David maintaining careful distance and Kendra speaking to no one. As we prepared to leave, Harold stopped and looked back at the house one more time. 30 years, he said quietly. 30 years of my life in that place. But not the rest of your life, I said, taking his hand. We still have time to build something new. Harold squeezed my hand and nodded. You're right, he said. Let's go home. But before we could get in the car, David approached us. He looked nervous, but determined. I want you both to know, he said quietly, that I'm not doing this to hurt anyone. I just want a fresh start for me and my kids. A place where we can build new memories. Harold looked at this man, this stranger, who now owned his family home. And I could see him struggling with his emotions. Finally, he extended his hand. Take good care of it, Harold said simply. There's a lot of love in those walls. David shook his hand solemnly. I will, he promised. And thank you for letting me give my children the stability they deserve. Kendra watched this exchange with an expression of pure disbelief. Her ex-husband and her father were shaking hands, making peace, while she stood there with boxes full of her childhood belongings and nowhere permanent to call home. This is insane, she muttered, but there was no fight left in her voice. This is absolutely insane. No, I said quietly. This is consequences. Our new apartment was small but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a decent kitchen, and a balcony that got morning sun. It wasn't grand like the house had been, but it was ours, truly ours, in a way the house never was. There were no ghosts here, no shrines to a previous life, no emotional baggage lurking in every corner. Harold adapted to apartment living better than I'd expected. He seemed almost relieved to be free from the constant maintenance and upkeep that the big house had required. He joined a seniors activity center, took up painting, and began making friends who knew nothing about his complicated family history. Most importantly, he kept his promise about Kendra. When she called demanding that he take her side in some new drama, he politely declined to get involved. When she criticized me or our new living situation, he defended me. When she tried to manipulate him with tears or guilt, he stayed strong. It wasn't easy for him. Kendra was his only child, and changing the pattern of their relationship after 34 years required constant effort. But he was finally learning what I tried to teach him for 3 years, that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. Kendra struggled with the new dynamic. She'd been used to having her father's unlimited support and attention, and suddenly finding herself held to the same standards as everyone else was a shock. She tried various strategies to regain control: tears, anger, manipulation, even bringing the grandchildren around as leverage, but Harold held firm. The house, meanwhile, was thriving under David's ownership. Within a month, he'd married his longtime girlfriend Sarah in a small ceremony in the backyard. The children had settled into their new school and made friends in the neighborhood. David had planted a garden and was hosting barbecues for the neighbors. The house had new life, new energy, and new happiness. Kendra had to drive past the house regularly to pick up and drop off her children for visits with their father. Each time she saw the lawn where Sarah had planted flowers, or heard laughter coming from the backyard where her own children were playing with their step-siblings, she was reminded of everything she'd lost through her own selfish choices. But the most bitter pill was watching how well David treated his new family. His second wife was welcomed warmly by all the neighbors who had known Kendra. David's stepchildren clearly adored Sarah and spoke about her with the kind of affection Kendra's own children had never shown her. The house that had been the site of so much tension and unhappiness during Kendra's marriage was now filled with the kind of love and stability she'd thrown away. 6 months after the sale, I ran into David at the grocery store. He looked healthier and happier than I'd ever seen him during the brief time I'd known him while he was married to Kendra. "How's the house treating you?" I asked. "Like home," he said with a genuine smile. "The kids love having a yard again, and Sarah has completely transformed the garden. It's like the place was waiting for the right family to appreciate it." "And Kendra?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. David's expression grew more serious. "She's struggling," he said. "The kids tell me she's bitter about everything that happened. She blames everyone except herself. You for selling the house, her father for signing the papers, me for buying it. She can't seem to understand that actions have consequences." "What about her relationship with her father?" "It's complicated," David said. "Harold tries to maintain contact, but she makes it difficult. She can't seem to accept that he chose his marriage over her demands. She keeps waiting for him to come back and apologize, but he's not going to." "That must be hard on Harold," I said. "Probably," David agreed. "But some lessons can only be learned the hard way." Kendra spent her whole life believing that her wants and needs were more important than everyone else's. Maybe losing the house and her father's unconditional support will finally teach her some humility. A year after the sale, Harold and I renewed our vows in a small ceremony at our apartment complex's community center. It was nothing fancy, just a simple exchange of promises witnessed by our new friends and neighbors. But it meant more to me than our original wedding had, because this time Harold was marrying me with full knowledge of who I was and what I was capable of. He'd learned that I wasn't the meek, accommodating woman he'd thought he married. I was someone who would fight for my own happiness and refuse to accept less than I deserved. I was someone who would take dramatic action when pushed too far and who wouldn't apologize for protecting myself from people who treated me badly. But he'd also learned that I was loyal to those who earned my loyalty, forgiving of those who genuinely changed their behavior, and capable of building something beautiful when given the chance. Kendra wasn't invited to the ceremony, though Harold had offered to include her if she was willing to treat me with respect. She declined, still unable to accept the new reality of her father's marriage. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she eventually moved to another state, taking a job that paid less but got her away from the daily reminders of everything she'd lost. Her children stayed with David most of the time, visiting her only during school breaks. She'd lost not just the house and her father's unconditional support, but much of her relationship with her own children. It was a harsh consequence for her behavior, but it was also entirely self-inflicted. She'd had countless opportunities to change course, to treat me with basic respect, to accept that her father had the right to remarry and be happy. Instead, she'd chosen pride, selfishness, and entitlement, and those choices had cost her dearly. Harold and I lived quietly in our apartment for 3 more years before his health began to decline seriously. When it became clear that he needed more care than I could provide alone, we moved into a senior living community with assisted care services. It was another adjustment, another downsizing, but we made it together as partners. Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in spring, 5 years after we'd sold the house. His final years had been our happiest together, free from the toxic influence of Kendra's resentment and manipulation. He'd finally learned how to be a husband instead of just a father, and I'd learned how to be a wife to someone who valued me. Kendra came to the funeral, of course. She was Harold's only child, and despite everything that had happened, she'd loved her father in her own selfish way. She looked older, tired, and somewhat broken by the years of estrangement from her family. She tried to approach me after the service, perhaps wanting to apologize or reconcile now that Harold was gone. But I wasn't interested in her regrets or her sudden desire for family harmony. Too much damage had been done, and too many years had been wasted. "I'm sorry for your loss," I told her politely, but I didn't linger for any extended conversation. Harold was gone, and with him went any reason for Kendra and me to pretend we could be family. I inherited Harold's portion of our savings and investments, which gave me enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. It wasn't wealth, but it was security and independence. More importantly, I'd learned that I was stronger and more capable than I'd ever imagined. The house where I'd once felt so unwelcome continued to thrive under David's ownership. His children grew up there happily, bringing friends home from school and hosting birthday parties in the backyard. Sarah filled the gardens with flowers and vegetables, and the neighbors all spoke of them as the kind of family that made a neighborhood better. Sometimes I drove past the house just to see how it looked. The paint was freshly maintained, the lawn was green and well-kept, and there were always signs of active family life. Bicycles in the driveway, toys on the porch, windows open to let in fresh air and sunlight. It looked like what I'd always hoped it could look like when I lived there, but never achieved because of the toxic atmosphere Kendra had created. David had turned that house into a real home, the kind of place where children felt safe and loved, where neighbors were welcomed warmly, and where every room held happy memories instead of bitter ones. It was everything the house could have been if Harold had been strong enough to stand up to his daughter from the beginning. But maybe things worked out exactly as they were supposed to. Maybe Harold and I needed to lose that house in order to find our real relationship. Maybe David and his family needed that fresh start more than we needed to keep fighting a war we could never win. Maybe even Kendra needed to lose everything in order to finally understand the consequences of her actions. I lived for 8 more years after Harold's death, spending my final years in a small but comfortable senior community where I made friends, took art classes, and volunteered with literacy programs. I never remarried. Harold had been enough husband for one lifetime, but I was never lonely either. When my time came, I faced it with satisfaction rather than regret. I'd learned to stand up for myself when it mattered. I'd refused to accept less than I deserved from the people who claimed to love me. I'd taken control of my own destiny when others tried to make me a victim of their selfishness. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to enable other people's bad behavior, even when that refusal causes pain. Harold became a better husband when he finally faced consequences for his weakness. Kendra's children got a more stable home life when she lost the power to manipulate their father. Even David found happiness and peace by getting the fresh start he deserved. The house I'd sold in anger and desperation became a symbol of new beginnings rather than old grievances. The money I'd claimed gave me independence and security in my final years. The marriage I'd fought to save became stronger and more genuine after I'd proven I was willing to lose it rather than accept disrespect. Sometimes the best revenge isn't punishment. It's simply refusing to let other people's limitations define your life. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but walking away from battles that were never worth fighting in the first place. And sometimes the most important lesson you can teach someone is that actions have consequences, choices matter, and love without respect is nothing more than comfortable exploitation. But there's one more thing I learned, something that took me years to understand fully. That moment when Kendra looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't welcome in my own home, that wasn't just disrespect. It was a gift. It was the moment I finally stopped trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. It was the moment I chose myself over their approval. She thought she had the power in that moment. She thought her father's silence meant she'd won. But what she didn't know was that she'd just handed me the keys to my own freedom. The house she tried to ban me from became the house that bought me a new life. And by the time she realized what had happened, it was too late to take back the words that changed everything. That's the thing about power, it's not always where you think it is. Sometimes the person sitting quietly at the table, absorbing the insults and filing away every slight, is the one who holds all the cards. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the most dangerous one in the room. Kendra learned that lesson the hard way. But then again, some lessons can only be learned through loss. Some people only understand consequences when they're standing outside the house that used to be theirs, watching someone else's children play in the yard where they once felt safe. I learned these lessons the hard way too, but I learned them completely. And in the end, that knowledge was worth more than any house could ever be. The moment my stepdaughter looked me dead in the eye and said I wasn't welcome in my own home, she thought she was ending the conversation. But really, she was just giving me permission to start a new one. A conversation where I did all the talking and the only voice that mattered was my own.